pleased to announce our guest speaker, Leslie Goddard. Leslie holds a PhD from Northwestern University, specializing in U.S. history and American studies, a former museum director, that she currently serves on the executive board of the Chicago Civil War Roundtable. Today, she will share with us the story of how Gone with the Wind was made, from the casting and the script and to the costumes and music. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Leslie Goddard.
Thanks. Thanks. So I have to ask, first off, is there anyone here who's ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind? Anyone here seen it more than 4 times? Anyone seen it more than 10 times, you think? Wow, that's remarkable, right? Well, I don't know if you know it, but this year marks the 80th anniversary of Gone with the Wind. In fact, I was at my local Walgreens today, and they actually had a whole magazine about it, which is actually pretty good. But how remarkable is that when you think about a movie 80 years beyond when it first debuted? And in fact, when you think about it, we are today longer away from the debut of Gone with the Wind than Gone with the Wind was from the start of the American Civil War. It's a really long time for a movie to stay that much in our minds. So I'm going to start, not today. I'm going to start on the night of December 15th of 1939. Anyone want to guess what happened that night? This was the debut of Gone with the Wind. And significantly, it did not debut in Hollywood. It debuted in Atlanta, Georgia, the major city where the movie is located. And the city that night could not have been more excited if the South had won the Civil War. And they still think they did, right? And the movie sort of gives you that impression. It was actually not a one-day celebration. It was a 3-day event. Major stars of the movie had flown in to see the debut. This is David O. Selznick with Olivia de Havilland, and in the middle there is some unknown British actress. Vivien Leigh was so unknown that on the night of the debut, she was actually listed in the credits 4th behind Clark Gable, Olivia de Havilland, and Leslie Howard because she was so unknown. 700,000 visitors had booked rooms in hotels in the Atlanta area, which is a lot because in the 1930 census, the city only had 300,000 residents. The governor of Georgia had proclaimed the day a state holiday. There were 3 days of not just the film screening, but parades. This is actually Clark Gable. Isn't that a fabulous car? This was one of the parades. There were some balls, including a ball. They found the debutante whose measurements most closely matched Vivien Leigh's. And she got to wear one of the dresses that Scarlett O'Hara wears in the actual movie. On the night of the premiere, it premiered at Loew's Grand Theater. And they made the front of the theater over to look like 12 Oaks. That's the plantation home of Ashley Wilkes in the movie. This movie theater only had 2,500 seats. So not all 700,000 people could fit into it. Ticket prices, which were normally 50 cents, had been jacked up to $10, which is huge by today's thing. Today, and scalpers were getting up to $200 per seat. Jockeying for tickets had been going on for months. At one point, the head of the Atlanta Daughters of the American Revolution was incensed to not get enough tickets. And a producer looked at her and said, "Wrong war." The fans who could not get into the theater stood outside to see the stars as they were arriving. The one everyone wanted to see was Clark Gable. And here he is arriving with his new bride. Anyone know who that is? Carole Lombard. They had just married that year. Margaret Mitchell was there that night. everyone in the audience was uniformly ecstatic about this movie. They were solemn at the scenes of the Confederate wounded. They cheered when Scarlett, do you remember the scene where Scarlett shoots a Yankee intruder? It was everything they could have hoped for. And front page news of the Atlanta Constitution. This was a photograph of Margaret Mitchell, who was there with Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh. Okay, that is Vivien Leigh on the left, Margaret Mitchell in the center. Margaret Mitchell was the author of the book Gone with the Wind. She was very, very short. And that's Clark Gable on the right. So, of course, the headline is that it's with Gable because nobody knows Vivien Leigh at this point. Jimmy Carter called this the biggest event to happen in the South in my lifetime. It was a massive success, that's right. And it went on to be a massive success around the country. In its first year of theatrical release, Gone with the Wind took in $14 million. Many theaters ran it for a year. In Atlanta, it ran for 2 years straight. By the end of its initial general release, it had grossed $32 million and would hold that record until 1965. In fact, if we adjust for inflation, oh, thank you. I was just wondering if it's possible to bring them down just up here at the front. If we adjust for inflation, in other words, translate 1939 money into today's money, it remains the all-time box office champ. Since 1939, it has taken in $3.3 billion. It has been re-released into movie theaters 9 times. In fact, earlier this year, it played at some theaters for the 80th anniversary. It beats out Avatar at $2.8 million and Star Wars at $2.8 billion and Star Wars at $2.7 billion. The film has been translated into at least 25 different languages. The American Film Institute, they compiled a list in 1998 of the 100 greatest American movies of all time. Gone with the Wind ranked number 4. It has spawned artifacts of all kind. Here's some of them. If you want to get an authentic Gone with the Wind costume, either Scarlett's dress or Rhett Butler's suit, it's going to run you between $300 and $400. But if that's not enough, you can pick up something like a Gone with the Wind garbage can or a Frankly, My Dear, I Don't Give a Damn t-shirt, something like that. When you look at the massive success of this movie, it's easy to think, well, of course, it must have been a great success. Everybody must have known going in that this was going to be a hugely successful movie. And there were some reasons to think that. The biggest of them being, it was based on one of the best-selling books of all time, and that is Margaret Mitchell's best-selling book, Gone with the Wind, which was published in 1936. To give you a sense of what a blockbuster this book was, when it first appeared, it had a price tag of $3. Most hardback books were about 60 cents at the time. Even with that, in its first 3 months, it sold 330,000 copies. It remained the #1 bestseller for nearly 2 years. It was really the first of the great bestseller books in American fiction. But very few Hollywood producers wanted to take a risk on it. And in fact, the guy who finally did produce it, who was David O. Selznick, when he was originally presented with the book, he was not interested at all. For one thing, his studio, this is the days of studio contract players, he didn't have a big female star to play Scarlett O'Hara, and that was a major part. But moreover, Margaret Mitchell wanted $100,000 for the rights to turn her book into a movie. That was astronomical. So he said no. And he knew, as all Hollywood producers did, this is going to be an expensive movie to make. The book itself is an epic. Has anyone here ever read the book? Then you know, it's huge. It's like a doorstop. So it was going to take a lot of work to cut it down to being a movie, and even then, it was going to be epic. It's epic in its scale. And Civil War movies had not been big hits in the 1930s. A number of them came out that decade, including, anyone ever hear of a movie called So Red the Rose with Margaret Sullivan? No, because it was a terrible movie and it went down right away. Shirley Temple had done some movies set in the Old South, but that was really the exception. When Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM Studios, the big studio, when he was presented with it, he said, famous last words, no Civil War movie has ever made a dime. Thus ended MGM's chances. So how do we account for this film's ultimate success? A lot of the reason is David O. Selznick. David O. Selznick in the 1930s was a young wonderkind, young guy. He'd started at MGM and quickly rose to become their sort of boy wonder. Many thought he would eventually take over MGM because he married Louis Mayer's daughter, Irene. So a lot of people were saying, the son-in-law also rises. But David O. Selznick was extremely ambitious and wanted to start his own studio, which he did. Here he is in his head office at Selznick International Studios. That's the name you'll see in the opening credits of this movie. He started this in his own studio in 1935. He was very imaginative, full of excitement and ideas, but absolutely chaotic in his working style. In fact, the making of this movie was utter chaos from the get-go. None of the male actors wanted to be in it. The working hours were intolerable. The leading lady couldn't stand the director couldn't stand David O. Selznick. No one could work well with David O. Selznick. And actually, David O. Selznick had just discovered Benzedrine, which was sort of, if you need a shot of energy, have some Benzedrine. So he was working, like staying up all night, eating nothing but peanuts and bananas. But for all the chaos, David O. Selznick was extremely perfectionistic. And because he was fortunate enough to actually be very gifted in what he did, he took extraordinary pains to make this movie exceptionally good. Let me give you a good example of that. Let's talk about casting, which means it's time for a little quiz. There's no grades and there's no prizes, so feel free to guess. You ready? I'll read it out loud if you can't read from where you're sitting. Which of the following casting choices were actually suggested? A, Mae West to play Belle Watling, the Atlanta Madam. B, Lionel Barrymore to play Dr. Mead, the doctor who they're hoping to find him to deliver Melanie's baby. C, Judy Garland for Scarlett O'Hara's younger sister, Careed. Or D, Lucille Ball to play Scarlett O'Hara. Lucille Ball? All of them? I think Lionel Barrymore would be pretty good. The answer is all of the above. These ideas all came from other Hollywood studios. Selznick asked them to send in ideas, and they sent in some that were really good and some that were just crazy. When Lucille Ball heard that, she said, "Are they crazy?" He also asked for and got suggestions from the general public. Some people actually sent him in full lists of the entire cast and who they thought should be cast in that role. Many sent in their ideas unsolicited. This is a note sent to Selznick from a woman in Florida who says, "Please don't spoil Gone with the Wind by putting Cary Grant in as Rhett Butler. What about Frederick March?" This is not a friend of David O. Selznick. It's just someone who feels she knows and she's got to tell him what to do. The only person who was really reluctant to weigh in on casting was Margaret Mitchell herself, which means I have another quiz question for you. Who did Mitchell say she thought would be perfect for Rhett Butler? Was it A, Clark Gable, B, Groucho Marx, C, Basil Rathbone, or D, Donald Duck? It better be C. The answer is B, C, or D, depending on when you asked her. Margaret Mitchell was famously hounded by the general public and reporters during the making of this movie. She wanted nothing to do with it. She felt when she had signed over the rights, she had actually given up any responsibility to take part in it. Although, you know, I was saying that she had asked for $100,000. David O. Selznick actually bought the rights for $50,000. That gives you a good idea of how many producers didn't want it. When she kept being hounded, she actually then started saying Groucho Marx, and then when she was still hounded, she started saying Donald Duck just to get people off her back. In the end, David O. Selznick did consider some actors other than Clark Gable to play Rhett Butler. He seriously considered Gary Cooper. He thought a little bit about Ronald Colman and about Errol Flynn, but really, everyone in the country seemed to be leaning towards Clark Gable, with the notable exception, of course, of Clark Gable. Clark Gable was a big star, and he didn't want to be in what he thought was going to be a woman's picture. This is the movie of Scarlett O'Hara. But he'd also had a big flop in an earlier movie called Parnell, which was terrible. And Clark Gable was actually, for all that he's such a powerful male presence, he actually had a bit of insecurity, which is kind of charming, about his own abilities. He did not want to make another embarrassment in a costume movie, so he wasn't going to do it at all. The only reason he agreed to be in the movie is because his contract wound up giving him a bonus, financial bonus, that was sufficient to allow him to get a separation and then a divorce from his then wife, Rhea. So he could marry the great love of his life, Carole Lombard. This is Clark Gable signing the contract. That's Clark Gable seated on the left. That is Louis B. Mayer on the right and David O. Selznick standing over them. Now, Louis B. Mayer's got a big grin on his face because this was a great deal for him. He gave the rights to use Clark Gable and $1.25 million towards the production cost for this movie. In return, he got 50% of the profits and the right to distribute the movie in MGM-owned theater. These were the days when Hollywood studios were allowed to own their own theaters. That was big money. So, but at this point, Selznick knew he needed to have Clark Gable. So he signed. He's probably not as happy about it as he looks there. But it gave him one big problem. And that is, when they signed the paperwork on this, it was 1937. David O. Selznick still had a contract with United Artists to release any Selznick International pictures in United Artists theaters. So he was going to have to wait 2 years in order to release Gone with the Wind. However long it took to make, could not open prior to 1939. So the question is, how does he keep the public from losing interest in Gone with the Wind in that time span? One way he decided to do it was to have a nationwide search for an unknown to play Scarlett O'Hara. And this has become the stuff of legend. He really did send out his casting agents across the country. They would go to community theaters. They went to drama departments at colleges and universities. In one day alone in Atlanta, 500 hopefuls came out. The whole effort cost Selznick $100,000, and it was pretty useless. Now, oh, wait, I have one picture. I think I have a picture of, there's Carole Lombard. One of the people that they actually considered was Carole Lombard to play Scarlett O'Hara, but the feeling was that she was a little bit too much of a comedienne for the meat of this project. In any case, they did get some people to be in the movie. 2 people to be in the movie from The Hunt for Unknowns. One of them was this woman. This is Alicia Rhett. She played India Wilkes, that is Ashley Wilkes' sister. She's the one who deliciously hates Scarlett O'Hara at the barbecue scene. It's not a huge part, but it's a good one. And the other one was a character called Maybelle Merriweather. She is the young woman on the lower left there, wearing a whitish dress. Maybelle Merriweather was a big part in the book, but a tiny part in the movie. But the reason I mention these two is that in the last 10 years, these two actresses have both sadly passed away, leaving today two credited actors still alive. One of them is Mickey Coon, who played Bo Wilkes. That is Ashley and Melanie Wilkes' son, who's a little boy. Anyone know who the other one is? Olivia de Havilland. She is 102, still alive and living. And think about this. There are four major characters in this movie, right? There's Scarlett O'Hara, Rhett Butler, Ashley Wilkes, Melanie Wilkes. Of the four, who is the only one who dies in this movie? It's Melanie, right? It's Olivia de Havilland's part of Melanie is the only one to die in the movie. Anyway, ultimately, Selznick decided he had to have a Hollywood actress who would have the acting chops to handle this part. And in Hollywood, everyone had their own idea of who would be great for it. Early frontrunners included Miriam Hopkins and Tallulah Bankhead, who were both Southerners, but were considered too old. I think Tallulah Bankhead, was 36 at the time. Joan Fontaine very much wanted to play Scarlett. They felt she was wrong and offered her the part of Melanie, but she said, no, but you might ask my sister, she might take it. And her sister was Olivia de Havilland. He did have discussions with Norma Shearer. She was the queen at MGM at the time, and they kind of ran it up the flagpole, but her fans were incensed at the idea that she might play so unladylike a character. She was also a bit older. She was actually nearing the end of her Hollywood career. Bette Davis very much wanted the part, and she was probably the front runner among the public. But Warner Brothers had her under contract, and they would only release her in a package deal with Errol Flynn as Rhett Butler. Davis refused that, and so did Selznick, so ultimately she was out. Bette Davis never thought Errol Flynn was a very good actor. Years later, she said, you know, I once heard Errol Flynn say he didn't think he was very good, and I admire his honesty. Katharine Hepburn also very much wanted the role. She lobbied pretty hard for it, but there were two problems. Number one, she had just had a string of box office flops. A lot of people thought her career in Hollywood was over. And David O. Selznick thought she was too ugly and didn't have enough sex appeal to hold Rhett Butler's attention, so she was out, if you can believe it. She came roaring back in a movie called The Philadelphia Story, which reestablished her career, and she went on to great fame. Ultimately, David O. Selznick screen test about 30 possibles, including a very young Lana Turner. This is 17-year-old Lana Turner in her screen test for Gone with the Wind. He also screen tested Joan Bennett, Jean Arthur. The closest he could get to his ideal was an actress named Paulette Goddard, who I'm sorry to say I'm not related to. She was close enough that in November of 1938, Selznick approached her about offering her a contract if she could prove she was married to Charlie Chaplin, because, you're going to be shocked when I tell you this, they were living together without being married. Which, in those days, Scarlett O'Hara could, break all the moral codes she wanted, but the actress who played her couldn't. When she couldn't produce a marriage certificate, they actually dropped Paulette Goddard. It is now December of 1938. They are only going to have Clark Gable January to June of 1939. They have got to start filming in January. Things are getting down to the wire. Art director Lyle Wheeler went to Selznick and said, let's film some of the scenes where we can use doubles for Scarlett and Rhett. let's start by filming the burning of Atlanta. This is a scene taken from history. It actually wasn't the Yankees burning Atlanta. It was the Confederates burning their own warehouses in the approach of the Yankees. So they did. What they did is, that way they could clear out the back lot at Selznick Studios and start building the exterior sets, and they could get some film in the can. So they did. They dressed up a lot of the sets in the back lot to look like Atlanta in the 1860s. They wired them up with kerosene tubes and water tubes. They brought in every single Technicolor camera in existence, which was 7. Technicolor was an extremely new technology. This is 3-strip Technicolor, big cameras. They each had a crew of 3 people. So they carefully laid out exactly where each camera would be, what they would film, and on the night of the actual burning, they set the buildings on fire. There could only be one take, right? The buildings are only going to burn once. And it was a spectacle. Flames were going up 200 feet into the air. People in Culver City started to call the fire department saying, should we be leaving town? There's a fire over at one of the studios. It was brilliant. If you look very down in the very lower left-hand corner, you'll see 2 tiny figures. Those are stuntmen dressed up as Rhett and Scarlett as they're fleeing in a horse and carriage through these flames. And they brought in spectators to see the filming. And the legend goes that in the middle of this brilliant blaze, Myron Selznick shows up. This is David O. Selznick's brother. He was an agent. And reportedly, he tapped his brother on the shoulder and he said, David, I want you to meet Scarlett O'Hara. Selznick turned around and there was Vivien Leigh, which sounds too good to be true. And in a way, it is. Vivien Leigh was not known in the US, but she was somewhat known in Great Britain. She was British. She'd starred in a few movies, most notably a film called Fire Over England, and she sent in her name by her agent to be considered for Scarlett. This is her in Fire Over England. Anyone know who the guy is that she's with? That's Laurence Olivier, who turned out to be the great love of her life. They were madly in love during the filming of Gone with the Wind, and eventually they did marry. Still, David O. Selznick did not seriously consider her. He wasn't overly impressed with this movie. And we know for sure that she was there. This is the crowd watching the filming of the burning Atlanta, and the circle that you see in the lower left, that is Vivien Leigh there that night. We do know it was the first time she and Selznick talked, and we do know almost immediately he scheduled a screen test for her. Her screen tests were vivid and fiery. She said the dress she wore was still warm from the previous actress. And on Christmas Day of 1938, she learned she had gotten the part. This was a 2-year process to get to her. You can actually go on YouTube today and see her actual screen tests. And they're great fun because she's got her British accent. And it's a little startling to see for this Southern belle. Many of the other female actors wanted to be in the movie, certainly Olivia de Havilland. Now, she was also under contract to Warner Brothers. The way she got out of it, she went to lunch with Jack Warner's wife and got her to argue her case, and she got the part. Hattie McDaniel won out over many, many other actresses to play the part of Mammy, this warm-hearted mother figure, but slave to Scarlett O'Hara. She is one of the outstanding features of this movie, but she was actually better known as a singer and a comedian when she got the part. She happened to give brilliant screen tests. Of the male stars, the opposite story, especially with Leslie Howard. Leslie Howard was more of a sex symbol then than he's probably remembered today. And he didn't want to be in it. He felt that it was another one in a line of watery intellectuals that he'd been playing. And he also felt, probably correctly, that at the age of 45, he was a little old to be playing Ashley Wilkes. Ashley is supposed to be 21 at the start of the movie. He's a little hard on that. He agreed to do it because he was given the right to produce his next movie. And that's what he really wanted to do. Here's a photograph of him actually looking at the book, Gone with the Wind. This is the only time you'll ever see Leslie Howard looking at the book. He very famously never read the book, showed up on the set often late, didn't even bother really to use a Southern accent. If you listen carefully, you'll hear him slipping into his British accent often. He was a born Brit. But he was the right physical contrast to Clark Gable in this movie. Clark Gable and Ashley Wilkes are complete opposite in their looks, and that made Leslie Howard perfect. Not to mention, he was in the 1930s a known Hollywood name, which means I have another quiz question for you. You ready? This one is true or false. Leslie Howard was paid more than Vivien Leigh for his work on Gone with the Wind. True or false? Vivien Leigh's in like 98% of the movie. But the answer is true. In fact, he was paid about double. Leslie Howard, if you can't read it, received $76,000. Vivien Leigh was paid just under $31,000. That is the power of having a name or not in Hollywood. Would you like to know what Clark Gable was paid? Clark Gable received $118,000. Olivia de Havilland received $25,000. The average American salary in 1939 was $1,400. So even then, Hollywood was a good deal. Selznick was just as exacting about the screenplay. He brought in Sidney Howard to do the screenplay, and Howard did the first overhaul of it, which was brilliant. Margaret Mitchell said her book was like a piece of fabric, so tightly enmeshed that if you remove one thread, the whole thing's going to fall apart. But Sidney Howard went through and just slashed scenes. He eliminated characters right and left. If you read the book, you might know. Scarlett O'Hara has 3 babies in the book. He just cut 2 of them out. The O'Hara family has all these family members living around them. Most of them are eliminated. It was a great rewrite. It still resulted in a screenplay that would have been a 6-hour movie. But by that point, Sidney Howard had had it. He gets screenplay credit for this movie, but that might be because he died a few months before the movie premiered. From then on, revisions were farmed out to a host of rewriters and rewriters and rewriters of the rewriters. Selznick just kept giving the script to new people to rewrite it. At one point, F. Scott Fitzgerald was brought in to rewrite it. One writer said David O. Selznick couldn't even look at the script before he just handed it to another writer to rewrite it. Nonetheless, they had enough that on January 26 of 1939, they began filming. The initial director was George Cukor. This is George Cukor, and yes, he looks a lot like David O. Selznick, but he wasn't. They were very physically similar, and they had the same glasses, and they were very good friends. George Cukor had worked for 2 years on pre-production. He lasted less than 3 weeks in filming, partly because he was a very warm, empathetic director. He liked to kind of schmooze around in scenes. Selznick knew this film had to move fast, and filming had to move fast. So Cukor was out, and they shut down production while they found a new director. And the new director they found was Victor Fleming. This is a photograph taken on set that is Clark Gable on the right, Vivien Leigh next to him, and Victor Fleming is sitting on the stairs. He's got the gray hair. I love this photograph because look how depressed Vivien Leigh looks. Vivien Leigh loved Cukor. Victor Fleming was as different from Cukor as you could get. He was very brusque, very manly, you know, the kind of guy who was going on African safaris on his free time. Huge contrast to this intimate, introspective style of George Cukor. But Victor Fleming, by the way, was plucked right off the set of another famous 1939 movie. Anyone know? Wizard of Oz. Can you imagine? Victor Fleming got directing credit for both Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, both in the same year. How's that for history? But they kept the production shut down for another week because Victor Fleming didn't like the script, so they rewrote it. They brought in Ben Hecht to do a rewrite. Actually, Ben Hecht, Victor Fleming, and David O. Selznick locked themselves in a room for a week. They literally didn't emerge while they hammered out a new script or a new revision of the script. By the end of it, Victor Fleming fell asleep so deeply they thought he was in a coma. One of them burst a blood vessel in his eye, but they had enough that they were able to go back into production. But even then, Victor Fleming struggled. This is Victor Fleming with Vivien Leigh. He was constantly goading Vivien Leigh to make Scarlett O'Hara bitchier. Vivien Leigh was very devoted to the book, and she thought the character was much more nuanced than what Fleming wanted her to play. At one point, Victor Fleming suffered a nervous breakdown. He had to leave filming for a few weeks, so they brought in a third director, who was Sam Wood. This is Sam Wood sitting with the box office star of 1939. That's Mickey Rooney on the left. As soon as Sam Wood was brought in, Victor Fleming had a miraculous recovery and came back. But they kept Sam Wood on to film B-roll, the background films. So Victor Fleming would receive credit, but this movie had 3 directors. Costumes and set, just as excruciating. This is Walter Plunkett. Under his direction, the costume department created 5,500 costume sketches, including these sketches for various costumes that Scarlett O'Hara would wear. And some of them are familiar. In the middle is what's called the barbecue dress. That's the dress Scarlett wears to the Wilkes Plantation barbecue. The curtain dress that she makes is the green velvet curtain dress. But what I'm interested in is this dress here, which is not very well known. This is a dress that Scarlett wears on her post-honeymoon visit to Tara with Rhett Butler. It's not a huge scene, but it's significant in showing the extent of research they did. Someone not too long ago, I think it was maybe 15 years ago, was looking through a back issue from, I think, 1867. Of Godey's Ladies Book. This was sort of the Vogue magazine of its day. It was a fashion magazine. And do you have one? Aren't they gorgeous? The fashion, they had this beautiful, I mean, this was magazine photography. These beautiful fashion illustrations. In one edition of Godey's Ladies Book, they found this red dress, and you see it in the upper left-hand corner there, which is so similar to the green and white dress. It must have been the inspiration. That's the kind of research the costume department was doing, and that is for a costume that appears very briefly in this movie. One costume, though, that appears very often is a purple calico dress. Scarlett O'Hara wears this for about at least a quarter of the movie, and it gets progressively rattier. When we first see it, it's in this scene. That's Scarlett O'Hara on the left. She is trying to help out as a nurse in one of the Atlanta hospitals, and she's terrible at nursing. I love this photograph. Fun trivia for you. Take a look at the shadows. The actors doing the shadows were not lined up correctly. So if you look especially at Melanie's profile, it doesn't match the shadow on the back wall, which is just fun trivia. Can't do everything perfect. As the movie goes on, they created other versions of this purple dress that they roughed up with sandpaper and steel wool and actual dirt. This is the scene where Scarlett actually shoots the Yankee intruder. Here is a scene where she's arguing with her father at Tara while her father is slowly going mad. This is actually very close to reality because many people in the South, because there was a blockade in the South, found themselves wearing the same clothes over and over and over from day to day and year to year. Similarly, the sets. Designers created multiple ideas for different sets. For example, they knew they needed to have a set for the interior of Scarlett and Rhett's mansion. This is the mansion they built in Atlanta after the war, and it was going to have a big dramatic staircase. because there's a scene where Scarlett and Rhett get in a fight, and he pushes her and she falls down the stairs and loses her baby. So they tried a couple of different options, including a rounded staircase and one that kind of makes a turn, before they finally came up with that big dramatic staircase that is actually in the movie. In the end, they built 90 sets for this film. All of them, by the way, were interior sets. Exterior filming was done on location in areas in California. Very little of this movie was filmed in the South. The only scenes in the South are in the opening credits. You'll see some background images of plantations and farm workers. Those were done in the South. And when Scarlett and Rhett go on their honeymoon, you'll see very briefly a steamboat that they're on going past. That's it. Everything else was filmed in the South, in the North. Even the scene where, do you remember the scene? Actually, here's a funny story. I was talking to a man whose mother loved Gone with the Wind when it first came out, and she told him, "You have to go see it. I'm giving you the money so you can go downtown and see the movie." So he did. He said he was 13 or 14 at the time. And he came home and she said, "What'd you think? What'd you think?" And he said, "Well, it was good, but it was a weird ending. It was like she gets home, but she's starving and she's in a field and she's screaming at the skies, and then the movie just ends." And his mother said, "You left at intermission." This movie has this famous intermission where she's back at Tara, and the only thing she finds in the yard that is edible are some turnips, and she eats some and then gets sick, and she says, what does she say? "As God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again." Then it's intermission, so his mother sent him back. Even that scene was filmed in California. My favorite set is Tara. This is the exterior of Tara. When Margaret Mitchell first saw this mansion, she laughed. This is supposed to be the O'Hara family plantation in Clayton County, Georgia. That's where the book and the movie is set. This is much larger and grander than any plantation house in that part of Georgia. Mansions like this were more suitable for Louisiana or Mississippi. But more fun for us. This is only a false front. There's nothing behind this set. If you walk through the front door, you'll just walk into the outside. Scarlett O'Hara's hoop skirt in this scene is much bigger than most women wore on an everyday basis. This is an enormous hoop that you might wear if you were being presented at court to Queen Victoria. The trees, as were very common in Hollywood at the time, they were telephone poles. They would shape them with chicken wire and plaster of Paris and paint them to be trees. They brought in crushed red tile to mix with the dirt to get that red earth of Tara. Remember the red, it's where you get your strength, the red earth of Tara. And my favorite bit of trivia, the front door is not symmetrical. If you were actually building a house like this with 4 columns across the front, where would you put the front door? In the very middle, right? They designed this house to be filmed primarily from the angle you're seeing it here. And to do that, they had to move the front door off center. You will almost never see this house dead on. But when you do, you'll notice that the front door is right behind one of those columns, which is just fun trivia. But even the lavishness of the set was not enough. They actually used a lot of special effects for this movie. Jack Cosgrove was head of special effects. He created hundreds of trick shots. For example, he used a lot of matte paintings, and that is where you would paint usually a part of a set on glass, and it would hang in front of the camera, so the camera would film both live action and the painting at the same time. Here's a good example of that. This is the image of the servants arriving at Scarlett and Rhett's Atlanta mansion. The only thing real in this photograph are the 3 actors and that red brick walkway. The trees and the house itself, everything else, is a painting. And we even know the walkway that they used for this was actually the front walkway of the main building at Selznick International Studios. Here's a photograph of what it looked like. And I'll go back, but you can see that walkway, the double walkway with the grass plots between it, are exactly what you see in this photograph with the actors there. Not all of the trick shots worked perfectly. One that really had trouble. This is the arrival of guests at the barbecue at the Wilkes family plantation. The only thing real in this image are the horses and the people and the carriages. Everything else is a painting. So they had to superimpose the horses and the actors and the carriages on that painting, and they didn't have time to get it perfect. So if you watch the movie, the carriages and horses are kind of transparent. They look like ghosts driving up that walkway, and that is just because they were so rushed on it. Perhaps the most lavish sequence was the scene at the Atlanta Railroad Station. This is a scene where Scarlett O'Hara is looking for Dr. Meade. And she encounters this yard, railroad yard, filled with wounded Confederate soldiers. And it's a great story. Can you see the crane over on the left? That was the crane they used to lift the Technicolor camera up 100 feet into the air to look down on this scene. Because what Selznick wanted was a sense of just the vastness of the number of wounded men. In fact, he wanted to have 2,500 wounded Confederates on the ground there. Central Casting couldn't come up with that many extras. The estimates vary. Somewhere between 800 and 1,500 extras were there, which is a lot, but not enough. So David O. Selznick had dummies created with sort of wax or plaster heads and then bodies. They laid them out on the ground and told each extra to lie down next to one of these dummies and reach underneath. There was either a stick or a string that they could pull to manipulate the dummy's arms or legs to give the scene the appearance of just a mass of writhing men. Then they actually, this is not a film camera crane. That is an actual construction crane that they brought in. They had to build a special platform to put the camera, and that's Victor Fleming sitting next to the camera up there. That's David O. Selznick on the far left. Selznick was everywhere in this movie. He was the most control freak. But let me see if I can play the clip quickly. That ruined building is a painting. And this is Scarlett O'Hara in the purple calico dress. It was supposed to be worn with a hoop skirt, so it's dragging on the ground. That was authentic for what happened during the war. Are you looking for the dummies? Sadly, now you can't unsee it.
But when you first see it, you don't know.
No, you don't notice it at all. Yeah, until someone pointed it out to me, I never noticed. Had the camera lifted up just a little bit further, you would have seen the telephone poles of Culver City. And there's the Confederate battle flag. Reportedly, during the premiere, Margaret Mitchell's husband leaned over and said, "If we'd had that many soldiers, we would have won the war," which was great. This moment is so iconic. It's been parodied over and over. My favorite parody was an episode of The Simpsons. The Simpsons buy a trampoline, and Marge, the mother, comes out one day, and there's a wounded kid on the ground, and the camera pulls back to show you that there are even more wounded kids on the ground. And then it pulls back further, and there's more wounded kids. This is a great homage to Gone with the Wind. The challenge of filming that scene is even more significant when you remember how new three-strip Technicolor was. It had only emerged in the mid-1930s, and the film cameras themselves were enormous. This is a photo taken during actual filming. That camera on the left requires a crew of 6 men just to move the platform it's standing on. Plus, you've got the camera operator, plus a light guy and a guy with a boom mic, and it was just enormous. MGM, Hollywood's biggest studio, hadn't done its first Technicolor movie until 1938. So it was a big deal for a new studio like Selznick Pictures to take it on. Oh, and one fun scene. The barbecue scene, they actually took over, Busch Gardens. What is the gardens that was right there? It was Busch Gardens, right, in California. They took it over for a day. So the filming of the barbecue scene with all this lush greenness and this beauty was not done in the South, but in a gorgeous garden in California. Another fun little bit of trivia about the set. The front door of the Wilkes family plantation was an actual front door of one of the Hollywood the Selznick sound stages. So when Scarlett O'Hara goes through that front door, she was actually walking right onto the set, and the camera actually followed her through that front door. If you watch this scene very carefully, and darn it, she's not in this image. The actress Marjorie Reynolds makes a very early appearance in this movie. Marjorie Reynolds, you might know, she was, yeah, Life of Riley, yes, and Holiday Inn as well. She is she has no lines, but she appears as one of the guests on the staircase here. Anyway, one of the things I think that makes this movie so astonishing is the visual contrast between those early scenes that are filled with the lush greenery and scenes like this with those magnificent dresses that women are wearing, with the color change at the end of the movie, when the color turns to grays and blues and burned out sets, and it just gives you this sense of desolation. Filming finished on this movie on July 1st of 1939. One of the last scenes they filmed was Rhett Butler leaving, which gives me another quiz question. You ready? What are Rhett Butler's final words in the movie? Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. If you read the book, the actual last line he has, it goes like this. Rhett drew a short breath and said, lightly but softly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Apparently, it was Selznick who added the word frankly. And isn't it perfect? It's like a bit of poetry right at that moment. But the bigger issue is, how did they get the word damn into this movie? These were the years of the Hollywood Production Code. This was the self-censorship agency of Hollywood studios. And they did say that hell and damn and other curses were expressly forbidden. There are various stories of how they get around this. Some people say Selznick just left it in and paid a fine, but there's no evidence he did that. He did actually ask his staff to come up with alternatives. Wait, should I play that moment? Do we have time? You got to see the last moment, simply because it's so good. This is Rhett deciding to finally, he's had enough. He's leaving Scarlett finally. And she's realized she loves him.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
American Film Institute named that one of the all-time greatest lines in American movie history. Selznick did ask his staff to come up with possible alternatives, and they're hilarious. Some of them are obvious, you know, like, my dear, I just don't care, which doesn't have the same poetry. But my favorites are things like, my dear, I just don't give a whoop. There's no evidence they actually filmed any of these. What seems to have happened is that Selznick convinced the Hays Code to be amended, which it was on November 1st, 1939, to say hell and damn are forbidden except where essential and required. Which means, of course, Selznick said, well, it's essential and required that the word damn be in this movie, and then all was fine. But interestingly, that's not the last line of the movie. Anyone remember what the last line of the movie is? You got it. If you don't remember, after Rhett leaves, Scarlett is distraught. She says, what shall I do? She gets this montage of images in her head of people telling her, go to Terra. It's where you get your strength, the red earth of Terra. I get goosebumps when I see it. She sits down, she sits down on the stairs and she says, that's it. I'll go back to Terra tomorrow and I'll think of some way to get him back. After all, tomorrow is another day. A lot of people said that the strength of the movie and the book is in this ending because it's a much more hopeful and resurgent ending than you might get if the movie ended with her she's lost everything, she's all alone, and she's in this big house with nothing left. It lets you leave the movie on a kind of hopeful note. And when you remember that both the book and the movie came out during the Great Depression, it helped to highlight that a big part of the theme of this movie is survival. And Margaret Mitchell said she wanted to write a book about the people who had gumption, the people who got through the war because they did what they had to do to survive. They were the ones who said, I'm not going to be defeated, this is not over, there's always tomorrow, tomorrow is another day. And in fact, the movie is full of those resurgent moments. I mentioned this one because Tomorrow is Another Day and As God Is My Witness, I'll Never Be Hungry Again, both also ended up on the list of all-time great movie lines in American history. After filming finished, they spent 12 weeks creating the score. Max Steiner, who's the guy in this photo with the headphones, was the composer. He wrote 2 hours and 36 minutes worth of music for this movie. The full movie runs 3 hours and 45 minutes. This is one of the longest movie scores ever created. And Selznick loved sweeping music. He told Max Steiner, just go mad with the schmaltz in the last 3 reels. Although Steiner's score, if you heard the music in that scene of the wounded men, you might notice it was actually a very nuanced score. He wove in a lot of traditional American songs, a lot of Southern songs. That scene included the music to Dixie, and at the very end you might have heard Reveille, taps, dun, 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 and so on. When Vivien Leigh got to Atlanta, there was a band at the airport playing music, and they started playing Dixie. Vivien Leigh was British, so she said, isn't that sweet? They're playing the song from the movie. And someone had to tell her, it's actually a traditional Southern song. Do you know when she got the part, some people were upset that it was going to be a Brit playing the Southern belle. And someone said, well, better a Brit than a Yankee. Editing was the last major headache. This is film editor Hal Kern. He spent 2 marathon months with David O. Selznick, which must have been a nightmare, getting that film cut down to about 4 hours, maybe 4 hours and a half. Then they took it out for private screenings in Riverside and in Santa Barbara, and then cut out another 45 minutes to get it to the final 3 hours and 45 minutes. And no one knows what happened to those 45 minutes that got cut. They're like the Maltese Falcon of cinema history. Most of the scenes were probably just entrances and exits, you know, tightening up the scene. The O'Hara family, O'Hara family going to the Wilkes Plantation barbecue, things like that. But there were some cavalry sequences. They wanted to take advantage of the fact that Leslie Howard had been a horseman during World War I. He'd been in a cavalry unit. He was a great rider. But they didn't have time for it, so they cut those, making Gone with the Wind the only Civil War movie without a single battle sequence in it. At one point, you'll see soldiers sort of marching in the background, but it's not really a depiction of a battle. It's more just, this was happening out in the past. The acclaim the movie got was everything they could have hoped for. There was not just a premiere in Atlanta, there were 2 more premieres. One in New York, where the movie had to premiere at 2 theaters simultaneously to accommodate the crowds, and then a 3rd gala premiere in Los Angeles. And the movie was breaking attendance records everywhere it went when it opened. At the Capitol Theater in New York, they were selling 11,000 tickets a day in January of 1940. Mostly the reviews were tremendous. The New York Times critics said, "We cannot get over the shock of not being disappointed by this movie." There were a few notable reviewers who were insulted by the movie's depiction of the slave characters. And there were some picketing, mostly outside of movie theaters in African American neighborhoods. These are picketers with signs that say, "Gone with the Wind, may it never return. $1.10, gone with the wind." That was the price they paid for a ticket. Interestingly, the film's depiction of the slave characters was a minor theme at the time of the movie's release, but has become a major issue among film critics today, who talk about the problematic nature of how the slaves are depicted, especially characters like Prissy. Butterfly McQueen created this great performance. But Margaret Mitchell was very disappointed. She said the Prissy that she wrote in the book was lazy, yes, but she wasn't dumb. She was crafty and clever. Prissy in the movie really goes down to a stereotype of the African American sort of dullard. In fact, all of the slaves' African American characters are depicted as sort of unable to probably live on their own, unfailingly devoted. This is the slave character going after the last rooster in Atlanta to be Christmas dinner for the white folks. That's actually Eddie Rochester on Jack Benny. That's not him? That's not Jack Benny. No, no, no. It's not? All right, we'll look it up. We'll look it up. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I was listening to him, and it sounded like him. We'll find out. We'll find out. In any case, that criticism of Gone with the Wind has become so dominant today. It was a minor thing at the time, largely because of the dynamic performance of Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh was absolutely groundbreaking in this role. The book starts by saying Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful. I think you'd be hard-pressed to say Vivien Leigh is not beautiful. She's stunning in this movie. But she brought to the part a lot more than just good looks. She had this kind of fiery intensity to her role. You might know her life was actually very sad. She suffered from what was probably manic depression in later years, and she died very young. She was 53 when she died in 1967. But she left this incredible legacy of one of the greatest film heroines we've ever seen. And in fact, she did receive the Academy Award for Best Actress at the ceremonies for 1939 movies. Gone with the Wind set a record for both nominations and wins. It got 13 nominations and received 10 awards, 8 competitive and 2 honorary. Hattie McDaniel became the first African American to win an Academy Award. The movie also won for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Interior Design, Best Music, and Best Editing. David O. Selznick won the Irving Thalberg Memorial Award. That's a special award for achievement in cinematic arts. Bob Hope was the master of ceremonies that year, and he got up at one point and said, "I think it's wonderful, this benefit we're having tonight for David O. Selznick." And this achievement is really remarkable when you remember that 1939 was one of the greatest movies in classic film history. I mean, it's the year of The Wizard of Oz, right? Not to mention, no, it wasn't Casablanca. Casablanca, I think, was 1940. But it was the year of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Wuthering Heights, Ninotchka, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, Stagecoach, huge number of phenomenal, phenomenal movies. But here's what I think. I think the legacy of this movie goes way beyond either the Academy Awards or the box office figures or the money from memorabilia and so on. I think its legacy is how deeply embedded it is in our culture. This movie has been parodied and satirized over and over. That's a scene from The Muppet Show on the upper left. On the upper right is a scene from French and Saunders. That's a British show. At the bottom is another Simpsons episode. The Simpsons has referenced Gone with the Wind at least 9 times. That's a scene where Homer is going on a diet. So he says, "As God is my witness, I'll always be hungry again." Can anyone think of the most famous parody of Gone with the Wind? You got it. If you're not familiar with the story, in 1976, NBC aired Gone with the Wind on commercial television for the very first time. And this is when Carol Burnett was very big. So Carol Burnett did a parody called Went with the Wind. In this, she wears a dress made out of her mother's green velvet curtains with the curtain rod still in it. Let's see if I can get it to play. It's probably not quite loud enough to hear.
And he could not.
They had to show him this dress before they filmed it because he would have cracked up.
He did crack up.
Yeah, he does, yeah.
You Dixon, you. Stop it. I love you. That gown is good.
If you didn't hear it, he says, "Scarlett, I love you. That gown is gorgeous." And she says, "Thank you. I saw it in the window and I just couldn't resist." It's just classic. That scene is so famous that the velvet dress that Carol Burnett wore is now in the American Museum, the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. The actual green velvet dress that Vivien Leigh wore in the movie is at the University of Austin, which is where David O. Selznick's archives ended up finally. And you can often go see it on display. It's faded very badly. In Atlanta, the Maine tourist office said that for many years, tourists' first question was often, "Where is Tara and is it open for tours?" In which case they had to say, "It's not. It's actually a dilapidated set. This is how it looked in 1959 when that land was Desilu Studios." There are, however, multiple Gone with the Wind museums. There is one in Marietta that you see on the upper left there. On the lower part there is a photograph of the Road to Tara Museum. That is in Clayton County, Georgia. The upper right apartment building, that is one of those apartments is where Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind. It is a museum today and sort of a center for Southern literature studies and heritage. But I think the most enduring legacy of this movie is set up in that opening poem. When the movie opens, you see this scrolling poem that talks about how there was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South, and here in this pretty land, gallantry took its last bow. This is where it is. This sets up for you a particular way to look at the Old South, and that is to see it as this land of beauty and wealth. You might call it moonlight and magnolias. That when the Civil War comes, is absolutely devastated and destroyed. This has become so much the way we think about the Old South and its relationship to the Civil War. And in fact, many Civil War movies have to grapple with this image of the Old South, no matter what they do. When you see other movies and TV miniseries about the Civil War, they'll often have these beautiful plantations. Here is still from a TV movie miniseries, North and South. Remember that with Patrick Swayze? This one, not only does it have the Moonlight and Magnolias set, it even has a snappish Southern belle right out of casting by Vivien Leigh. In one part of Georgia, they used to have an Azalea Girls Festival. They actually had to give it up a few years ago because critics said it was too reminiscent of Gone with the Wind, and it was raising problematic issues about the movie's depiction of slavery and what it has to say. A couple years ago, there was a beautiful movie, maybe you heard of it, called 12 Years a Slave. And a lot of the reviews of that movie, references were made to, isn't it amazing how far we have come from Gone with the Wind to this? In other words, Gone with the Wind is this touchstone for how we think about the Old South. You have to refer to it, whether you are disagreeing with it or agreeing with it. And that's actually part of what Margaret Mitchell wanted. When she wrote Gone with the Wind in the 1930s, and the 1920s actually is when she wrote most of it, she was responding to a lot of unfavorable depictions of the Old South, which were actually perpetrated by another literary and stage work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she was very upset at how Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the most staged play in the United States in the 19th century, how it depicted slavery. She wanted to depict something different. So what she depicted was life in the South as she felt it existed. And when you look at the slave characters, they are uniformly loyal. These are the male slave characters who are off to dig trenches for the white soldiers, the white Confederates during the war. This is I mentioned this is the #1 criticism. Someone actually said, the film never really grapples with the real problems of slavery. At one point, Ashley Wilkes says, I would have freed all my slaves eventually anyway. Which raises the question, okay, so how were you going to run this plantation? Because it was all built on slave labor. So where do we stand today? Well, I think Gone with the Wind has become a problematic movie. Because on the one hand, whether you like the way it depicts the Old South and slavery or not, you have to recognize what a great work of sheer filmmaking this movie is. The characters are powerful and vivid. I don't know many women who could see that scene where Scarlett O'Hara gets her first glimpse of Rhett Butler and you don't get a little flip in your stomach. On an emotional level, this movie works exceptionally well. It is an achievement in both cinematography and in sheer acting performance, not to mention sets and costumes and screenplay. I think there's a reason that so many people adore this movie and watch it every year and want to go to Georgia and see it, and sometimes want to have tour guides who dress up like Gone with the Wind characters and give you a tour guide, and there are. I think both of these things are true. And that's okay. Because that's the way great entertainment often works. It forces you to go on a great emotional cinematic journey. At the same time that maybe it makes you think about the relationship of the themes to your own life. I think the greatest legacy for many Americans is that when we think of the Old South, we think of this, which is really a British woman in an impossibly large hoop skirt, standing in front of a false facade house that's not even symmetrical with trees made out of telephone poles. To many Americans, this is what the Old South is. That's a phenomenal legacy in any point. So I'm sorry, I'm going to stop talking there and say thank you all so much.